as well.
Yeah. How come does the regular media does not, warns us about this or tells us about this? What's happening? Because this is a rather,
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Well, a lot of the media is supported by advertising from companies like McDonald's and companies like that. But, that's kind of a cop-out answer in a way, because we could educate, we could educate McDonald's and some of those companies to start offering, just like they've started doing with offering BO products and things like that. Now we have a BO burger, things like that. Because if they make money off of it, they'll sell it. So you need to educate the consumer to be interested enough
and asking for
to ask for it and demand it. And so then it will start to be offered no matter what. Because I don't buy that argument that they're all out to kill us or to make us infertile. They aren't.
To illustrate the power of the consumer, basically, maybe you can tell about the example of the bovine growth hormone.
Yeah, well, the bovine growth hormone is a good example because so many people stood up on their on their hind legs and objected to the use of the BSG meat that they stopped using it wherever they could. I mean, it's still there's some use of it some places, but generally it's been greatly reduced.
Yeah, Alimentarius is providing guidelines which are from the guidelines towards the enforcement, basically. How does the legislation work, trickle down, if you will, through to the national government and to the local supermarket and factory? How does it work?
Well, in general, with Codex, it doesn't have any direct enforcement powers, so you're hitting on an interesting point here, and that is the guidelines are being created, and keep in mind it's not a monolithic thing with just one guideline. There are hundreds of guidelines on different things, from natural mineral waters to, like I was saying, aluminum in foods, to aspartame, to all sorts of different standards being created. But how do they get put into effect? Well, it really depends on the country. But a lot of people are a lot of countries are tied into the Codex standards through trade agreements, through like the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, the technical barriers to trade agreement, which all of these countries, almost all of these countries are signatories: the EU, the US, the UK, Norway, Canada, South American countries and the like are all signatories to this, and these commit them to implementing domestically in their legislation and in their own laws and in their own regulations the Codex standards. So it's tied in that way. And then what happens is, as people become increasingly familiar with the Codex laws, as the legislators do, then they start writing it into the laws as well. And they've started doing that in the US and Canada, where they directly refer to Codex Alimentarius.
So has there been any national government resistance to Codex guidelines? So like the government saying, well, we don't like this particular guideline, we sort of like skip it, or...
Well, that's another interesting question, because it used to be written in the Codex Procedural Manual up until about 3 or 4 years ago that each government had the right, each member state of Codex had the right to either accept, reject, or accept with reservations any Codex standards. And then mysteriously, and again, NHF was one of the, I think we were the only ones to object to it at the General Principles Committee meeting in Paris in 2006, I believe it was. Could have been 2007, to object to the removal of that language, of that part of the procedural manual. And now there's nothing, there's no acceptance, rejection, rejection or acceptance with reservations rights there.
Is the Codex Alimentarius Commission encountering any national government resistance?
Not really. I mean, there was a time when the South African government offered resistance on certain issues, but in general, no, they all like what Codex is doing. So the national resistance is non-existent. In fact, some of the third world countries, the developing world, as we say these days, are so eager to adopt the standards. They're even adopting them for their own national legislation before Codex finalizes them, before Codex itself adopts them. So it's a real issue.
Okay. Okay. Can any individual persons or companies find any remedy in court? You know, if they encounter a new legislation that is due to come into existence thanks to Codex Alimentarius, can they find any remedy in court? You know, object or
well, I would say in most countries no. In the United States, maybe Canada, there are some remedies, but they'd be very expensive, and the likelihood of a favorable outcome is pretty slim, pretty low.
Yeah.
So as a practical matter, probably not. But it doesn't hurt to try. You never can tell if you won't win or not. So
Sure.
just as long as you have the money and the people behind you, you could launch a challenge and see. Because in the U.S., it certainly violates some constitutional rights. And it certainly violates the division, the separation of powers amongst the states and the federal government. But in other countries, except for maybe Canada, you don't really have that kind of a protection. So, and the courts these days are so corrupt in terms of what they would allow a citizen to bring as a lawsuit, that it's unlikely a court judge would rule favorably anyway. They wouldn't follow the law, in other words.
Yeah. What is the relation of the Codex Alimentarius with the Euro Commission and the EU directives and the Obama healthcare system? Is there sort of like legislation coming from, or guidelines coming from the Codex Alimentarius that influences both the European Commission and the Obama healthcare system? Is there interaction going on?
Well, there's interaction on a formal and informal stage, but in terms of are they tied in legally, no they aren't. They're definitely separate systems, but what you find is with the, say, the EU food directives, the food supplement directive, they tried to, the European Union delegate tried to mirror the Codex Alimentarius food supplements guideline right after the European Union Food Supplements Directive, even word for word, even to changing the title, which originally had been had been the supplement guideline to food supplement guidelines, so it would correspond with and match the European Union's Food Supplements Directive. And they were quite successful at that because the head of the committee for nutrition under Codex was a German, and he responded very favorably to the European Union's needs and wants and desires, and so he would pretty much give carte blanche to anything the EU delegate wanted, and they would pass it, and so that's what's been going on.
So there's a harmonization going on?
There is, but it's less, it's not so much that it's formal that they have to do it, it's just that they see the common interests and they do it.
Okay.
And so the same thing with the Obamacare that you mentioned, they see some common interests, and so they say, hey, we want to write standards or write law along the same way that they've done with the Codex Alimentarius Commission in those areas where there is some overlap or could be overlap, so they'll use that kind of language. Because things are becoming so globalized and so internationalized that instead of just looking to what's happening in Belgium or the Netherlands or the United States or Russia or whatever, they're saying how is it going to impact us internationally, and then they'll look at the global implications.
Yeah, so they try to synchronize the local laws with
They
the
really
international guidelines.
They do, because they realize it's a bigger world out there than just their own countries these days.
Okay. What has been the effect of the Codex Alimentarius on society so far? Do you have any tangible example that you can say, well, we saw first this in a guideline and now it trickled down all the way to things that happening locally?
Well, it's really been much more subtle. I don't know if I could give one particular example, but just sort of the general feeling that things, like I was mentioning before, have become globalized. There are not so much in the food supplement area, it hasn't happened, certainly not in North America, certainly not in the US, but in certain food trade like fruits and vegetables and things of that sort where they refer to international standards in terms of labeling and the like, yeah, it's had some impact, but it's nothing that the consumer necessarily sees right away, at least not visibly so.
Yeah.
So in terms of something that is hard and fast and that you could point to and say, yes, my life is so different now because of this, there isn't anything right now that really exists like that. But that day is arriving. It's not far on the horizon, far from us on the horizon, but that day is arriving.
So we could expect some sort of mark of approval on products or something like that?
You already do see it a little bit. Sometimes in some, like I've seen it on some Turkish labeling and some others where they say formulated or packaged in accordance with Codex Alimentarius.
Okay.
You've started to see some of that, but whether we really notice it in reading a label with a lot of words on it, most people don't.
Yeah. But so it's more like going top down from the companies on. So the companies have more to do with the legislation than the consumer will see actually.
Right, they do, and that's very well put because they'll notice it much more than the average consumer.
Yeah, okay. So the EU is like the leader.
They really, not on everything, but they certainly are on food supplements, they're the leader.
Okay.
And certain other areas as well, I mean mineral waters they are. Some of the contaminants in food, the CCF committee that I mentioned before, the Codex Committee on Contaminants in Food, the EU is clearly the leader there. But it's kind of funny, you see a rising, now the influence more of China and India, they're being more assertive because it's tougher for them, well, not so much the Indians, but the Chinese, because to participate in these meetings because they're conducted in either French, Spanish, or English. And by the time they get the interpretation, and then it filters through what did they mean, and it's being interpreted into English, and then they have to do their own self-interpretation into Chinese, well, they're already on to the next topic, and it's too late to object, or they didn't understand really what was going on. But an interesting change has been that of late, the Chinese and the Indians have been much more assertive, and so you see a more bipolar or multipolar world going on at these meetings than before, where it was just a yes-man operation between the EU delegate and the chairman or chairwoman of the committee. Sometimes the American or the Canadian or the Australian or New Zealand delegates will have an impact because they're very vocal, but and actually very well spoken. But really it's the EU delegate that was the driving engine more than anything else, and that's in the form of Basil Matthew-Dakis, which brings to another question that is very interesting that your viewers should perhaps know. So he was our archenemy during the heyday of fighting the food supplements standard at Codex.
What's his name?
Basil Matthew-Dakis, a Greek gentleman who is based here in Brussels and is the head of the delegation of the EU delegation, then called the EC delegation. It just changed its name last year, I think.
EC stands for European Commission?
Yes, or European Community, I think in this case.
Okay.
And he was at the forefront of pushing through these standards that the NHF, the National Health Federation, opposed very strongly. He and I used to have knockdown, drag-out arguments on the floor in 2003, 2004, 2005, even 2006, where we hated each other's guts virtually. But and just very bad exchange of words as we fought this. Well, the funny thing is, now that he's gotten pretty much what he wants, which is at least the framework for the food supplement standard,